hidden behind a waterfall near the peak of Mount Kuko, hides the next essence of nature. However, there's quite a bit more for Link to do before he can get there, including getting the flippers from the master diver just north of Sunken City, and a return trip to Subrosia. A couple of little rascals down here will steal Link's recently acquired Rock's Feather, but after recovering it, we can return to the Temple of Seasons and obtain the power of spring. This change in season opens up new paths in Holodrum, as these stone buds will bloom into flowers. Now we can help Moosh get some bananas so that he'll help us get the Dragon Key, which of course will unlock the next dungeon. Welcome to Dancing Dragon Dungeon, and let me just say, this is a good one. For whatever reason, out of all of the dungeons between these two games, this one always stands out in my memory as one I always look forward to playing through. I just find myself having a great time in here. Dungeon is fun. Fungin. In terms of aesthetics, it's just okay. The overall color palette of gray and this yellowy green is not my favorite combination, but it sure could be worse. It isn't exactly the same, but the floor and wall textures do bear a passing resemblance to those of Turtle Rock in Link's Awakening, albeit with some tweaks and overall more uniformity, and a different color palette of course. Regardless, the architecture is not exactly where this dungeon shines. I would hesitate to call it outright ugly, but beyond that there's not much more to say. The music, on the other hand, is absolutely a great time. It's actually a bit funny that they follow up the dungeon which had the worst music immediately with the dungeon that has the best music in the game. There's something about it. The melody, that bass line, it's so danceable. Such a banger. I can't help but wonder about how this ties into the dungeon's naming convention. There's no dragon in this Dancing Dragon dungeon, and the dungeon layout and shape don't seem to fit into this either, as near as I can tell. So I wonder, was the dungeon named this because of the superbly danceable music, or did the composer decide to make the dungeon theme a total bop because they saw they'd be writing music for a place called Dancing Dragon Dungeon? Chicken or the egg scenario, who knows? Regardless, it's a great piece, and this is Game Boy music. Talk about making do with what you've got. The previous dungeon themes have sort of stuck to this formula of alternating between curious and danger sections. This one seems to deviate from that, adding a sort of confident swagger to the dungeon music. And I think that fits. We're basically at the halfway point of the game, and settling into something of a gameplay rhythm. And I think reflecting Link's comfortability and confidence in dungeon crawling within the music before we get to some of the game's tougher dungeons makes a lot of sense. At least that's how I interpret it. Dancing Dragon Dungeon further ups the ante here by having 3 floors, although Basement 1 is pretty small, containing only a handful of rooms leading up to and including the boss fight and Essence Room, 5 to be exact. The bulk of the dungeon, meanwhile, takes place on the top 2 floors, with the equivalent of 18 standard-sized rooms on the first floor, 15 on the second, and an additional 2 that make up this side-scrolling hallway, all in all totaling 40 standard rooms, which is pretty sizable. It's cool to see dungeons this big this early in the game. I mean, this place is almost as big as Turtle Rock, the final dungeon in Link's Awakening, which, for comparison, had 46 standard rooms. Of course, there are some instances of larger rooms taking up 2 map tiles, but the majority of them keep to that standard room size. So when it comes to room orientations and layouts, there's a bit less variety here compared to the last 2 dungeons, dungeons, but I'd argue that there's enough fun stuff going on in here to make up for that. The rooms may mostly be uniform rectangular chambers, but the puzzles and obstacles found within are varied and interesting. I do think it's a bit odd that the dungeon entrance is on floor 2 though. Not that the entrance being on the top floor is out of the ordinary, but usually the ground level is floor 1, and if we're going down from there, it would be into the basement. That said, the entrance when viewed from the exterior is on a mountainside, not ground level, so it actually does make sense. The overall navigation centers mostly around following the dungeon's various branching paths. Even from the very onset of the dungeon, you'll be seeing forks in the road, with one of them ultimately being a dead end until the necessary keys are found, which will be hidden down the other paths. And I mean that in both the literal key sense as well as the item gate sense. So there is a sort of constant process of elimination to the progression here. As you see which paths are viable, follow them to their conclusions and then check the other paths. Considering how infrequently the Oracle games tend to implement any sort of core central room, having this split path and backtrack structure works surprisingly well. It feels like the dungeon is appropriately tackled in manageable chunks, which you will need to crisscross a bit before moving on to the next chunk, with very little reason typically to backtrack to a previous section unless you missed something crucial on your first visit, like one of those aforementioned small keys. The core dungeon gimmick employed in that exploration is the use of these minecarts, requiring the player to flip various levers, which switch the minecart tracks, allowing us to reach new areas. It's a fun enough mechanic that adds memorable set pieces to the way we just move about in here. Exploring is fun enough on its own, but there's something exciting about hopping in the cart and just seeing where it takes you. I think if every dungeon was like this, that I would get tired of it, but it is used sparingly enough in these games and just adds a little bit of extra flavor, breaking up the monotony of just walking from room to room and making every trip in the cart feel like something of a commitment. Moreover, it builds on the concept really nicely, iterating on the idea. It begins with us flipping a lever with our sword just while we're passing by, then later needing to use the dungeon item to flip a switch out of reach, and eventually needing to flip multiple distance switches in a row. Speaking of which, the dungeon item here is the slingshot, which works exactly as you'd expect, though I think this is probably the most interesting version of a slingshot in the entire series, since instead of having its own dedicated but ultimately standard ammunition like in other games, you use the various seeds from your seed satchels instead, which can have different effects. The ember seeds we found back in Gnarled Root being the important ones here. So in essence, we get a fire-based projectile attack with this item, which is pretty cool, though you could also look at this as being sort of an upgrade to the seed satchel, allowing you to fling seeds at a distance rather than having to be right up against whatever you're using them on. This will be put to use in combat, of course, but more importantly, for puzzle mechanics, as the dungeon starts putting torches that need lighting out of reach. And of course, combining this concept with the previously mentioned minecarts, with switches and torches needing to be shot in succession as a sort of reflexive, reaction time based puzzle. This is good stuff right here. Of course, like the prior dungeons, the slingshot isn't the only useful tool in Link's arsenal here. There's a ton of use cases for previously acquired items, such as the ember seeds being put to use before we even get the slingshot, bombs to break open destructible walls, and the roc's feather to jump over gaps. It even gets combined with the Pegasus seeds to enable longer running jumps, much in the same way as we could do with the Pegasus boots in Link's Awakening. The flippers in particular, which we found during the dungeon lead-up, get to really shine through here. We need to use them to cross huge flooded sections of the room, dive to avoid spike traps, and even retrieve both a small key and later the boss key from underwater. Before finding the dungeon item, in the near center of floor 1, we'll encounter the mid-boss. This guy is called Agunima. Fighting him is pretty interesting. Agunima will summon illusory copies of himself, and you'll need to spot the visual tell to figure out which one is the real one, though that visual tell is what sets this fight apart from other illusory copy fights that we've seen throughout the series. The room will continually darken, with us needing to keep these torches lit. This is important because only the real Agonima will cast a shadow, so make sure you're stocked up on those ember seeds. There is a Deku Scrub a couple of rooms back who will sell them, though you can reliably get them as item drops from the bushes in the room here, so I would save the rupees personally. All in all though, this is a pretty decent fight. Like the Omwai, if I'm even pronouncing this right, I think the real challenge here is figuring out how to even deal damage, as once you know what to do, it ends up being pretty easy. But that cryptic element is the main roadblock here. That said, I think it is a fair amount more intuitive than the Omwai fight.
Oh, I think I see it. He's got a shadow, which is why you need to light the torches. Okay, that's pretty clever.
I do need to address Agonima's name and appearance as well though, which seems like a pretty deliberate reference to Aghanim from A Link to the Past. Apparently, some old strategy guides even did refer to this character as Aghanim. Of course, the similarities are undeniable, but I don't think that this is canonically the same character. In fact, here's what Zelda Wiki says about the name. Agonima's name is identical to Aghanim's Japanese name, Agonimu, except for the final kana, ma, instead of mu. Rather than a spelling mistake, this appears to be intentional to distinguish him from the real Aghanim. So there you have it, a reference to A Link to the Past, but not the same wizard canonically. So with all that done, once we've retrieved the boss key and found our way down to the bottom floor, we can use the slingshot to extend this bridge and confront the dungeon boss. Dropping from the ceiling is this game's version of Goma. Here we go again, here we go again. We all know her, we all love her, it's Goma, big eyeball and all. Though I do think it's interesting to compare how different games interpret the iconic boss. This one clearly iterated on the Link's Awakening version, visually using that sprite as a foundation to build off of, changing the color palette and perhaps most notably adding those big ol' crab claws. Though the way she drops off the ceiling feels like a direct callback to the Goma fight in Ocarina of Time, but done as well as they could on the Game Boy. Seeing its shadow creeping towards you is a great little detail especially. Goma's designs historically have fallen somewhere along a spectrum with Spider on one end and Crab on the other, Wind Waker being an outlier here. Twilight Princess and Echoes of Wisdom have the most spider-like designs, whereas I'd say this take on Goma has gotta be the most crabby version to date. It works though, and it helps this one stand out among the gallery of Gomas. As for actually fighting Goma, this one is a pretty fun battle, and that crab claw isn't just for fashion either, it's actually functional. Goma will attempt to grab you, and if successful, will slam you against the ground and toss you across the room. This sort of attack is really cool to see, honestly. Something about a boss being able to just overpower you like this makes them feel like so much more of a threat, and it's kind of surprising that they could get something as cool as this to work on the Game Boy. She'll also spawn little Goma babies, which can be disposed of to replenish your stock of items. Of course, in order to deal with Goma herself, you'll need to first disarm her. That is to say, we gotta break her claw right off like some sort of peckish aristocrab. Once we've broken through that defense and removed the hazard of being manhandled, we can target Goma's vulnerable eyeball with the slingshot to deal damage, and eventually eventually bring her down. I should mention as well that just in case that big eyeball weak point isn't obvious enough, the owl statue right before the boss room does give a pretty well-worded hint towards this. Otherwise, I don't have too much more to say about this fight. Goma is a pretty consistently fun boss battle, and I appreciate the added crabby twist this particular version of the boss brings to the table, but it is otherwise still very much Goma. So with enough hits to the eye, Goma will go down. Once she's defeated, we'll be able to find the Soothing Rain, the fourth essence of nature. So, overall, Dancing Dragon offers us a fun dungeon above all else, one that is broken into several manageable chunks that can each be tackled in relatively quick succession, which makes progress through here feel winding and twisting, while simultaneously like you're constantly progressing forward. In some ways, it's a lot like the 3-act structure that many other dungeons use, but if it were like 5 or 6 smaller to medium-sized acts instead of 3 big ones. While the dungeon doesn't really have any big picture overarching puzzles, each of these smaller segments are filled with a bunch of fun little micro challenges. And of course, the music is so fun. So fun, in fact, that I had to commission Wolflink's Shadow to make me a cover of this song to use in this video. That's what you're hearing in the background right now, and I love it. Man, thanks so much. By the way, he also did the Tarm Ruins cover that you heard at the beginning of the video. Links to his channel are down below in the description, of course. So, in an earlier version of this script, I speculated that Dancing Dragon Dungeon may have been a heavily reworked Manji, the third dungeon from the original Legend of Zelda. I can see where my head was at when I wrote that, particularly when looking at floor 1. I was thinking maybe they were trying to make it look less Manji-like, so as to avoid some controversy. However, the more I look at it and compare the maps, the less likely I feel this is the case. Gnarled Root's connection to the eagle was solid, but Dancing Dragon's resemblance to the Manji may be a bit of a stretch, especially considering the lack of an eastern spoke, and the orientation of the symbol being mirrored. It's just too different, and while yes, Goma is also in Zelda 1 as a dungeon boss, it's for an entirely different dungeon. In fact, I'd say that the first floor's layout in Dancing Dragon bears just as much of a resemblance to the eagle as it does the Manji, so I changed my mind on this. If there is a link there, it's too weak for me, and if they did start with that as a foundation, whatever overhauls they did make are significant enough to fool me. Those loose potential connections aside, the dungeon that we did get is a bit of an odd one. On paper, I almost feel like I shouldn't like it as much as I do. No central chamber, no big interconnected puzzles, or novel mechanics that aren't present in other dungeons, yet I always find myself beaming while playing through here. There's this intangible element of fun here that's hard to pinpoint, but I know it when I feel it. The dungeon is a bit labyrinthian, with lots of forks in the road, tons of hidden goodies to collect, not just the map and compass, but keys stashed behind easy to intuit puzzles, which open the various locked doors along what is ultimately the critical path. And the way the mechanics that are here get iterated upon is great. We were introduced to how minecarts work back in Gnarled Root, but now the paths split off more frequently. The levers have an added element of distance and timing that we hadn't encountered before. We all know the mechanic of torches that need lighting too. Nothing super groundbreaking there, and you use that mechanic to light up a dark room. Makes sense. But then it gets incorporated into the mid-boss fight, and then into that same minecart mechanic. It's the way these puzzles build on themselves. It's so expertly crafted. A few more stray thoughts I have. There's this one puzzle where we need to push a handful of pots to stay on multiple floor switches. This is something of a follow-up to a puzzle back in Poison Moth's lair, but instead of just one button, now there's a whole bunch of them. And in order to get yourself into position to push them, you need to break just a couple to get in there, but not too many or you won't have enough pots for for all the switches. I think this is neat. It's simple enough, but it's an exercise in planning, positioning, and most importantly, restraint. Seriously, whenever I see a bunch of pots in a room, my instinct is to just start smashing them for item drops. I will say that I have learned this lesson the hard way and had to go reset the puzzle. Whoops. I also mentioned before this room in which you need to light these torches. The floor is already dark, and you need to move along these narrow walkways to get the treasure chest in here. The floor isn't invisible, but it's a dark floor over a dark chasm. Unfortunately, this puzzle ends up feeling a bit superfluous on modern screens, because, well, I can see the floor just fine. I imagine this was a lot more dangerous on the original, non-backlit Game Boy Color screen, so this is kind of a weird case where the inferior hardware is actually to the benefit of the puzzle design. There's also the boss key puzzle. You have to fight a bunch of enemies in this room with this skull-shaped island, and then dive down the right or left eye to retrieve the boss key from underwater. This itself is a sequel to an earlier puzzle where we saw a small key drop into the water, but we didn't get that preview this time. It's a bit funny though, because it's almost too intuitive in a way. I personally never struggled to find that key. I think on just about every playthrough of this game, I've always ended up finding the hint for the puzzle after I already got the boss key. Thanks anyway, old man. So overall, Dancing Dragon is a solid dungeon, one that I always look forward to revisiting, and what it may lack in novelty, it makes up for in polish. Minecarts and switches aren't exactly original ideas, but that's fine because they're implemented so well here. This is an extremely refined and well-designed dungeon, and I guess it just goes to show that you don't always need to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes tried and true designs and building on top of a solid foundation is more than enough, which in some ways is kind of the principle that these Oracle games adhere to in general. But seriously, that dungeon music is so great. Thank you so much for watching. Special thanks goes out to my supporters on Patreon, as well as my channel members here on YouTube, the names of which you're seeing on screen right now. You all are awesome. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.